Standing in front of the El Jem Amphitheatre, it's hard to believe that this isn't in Rome. In fact, it's right here in Tunisia. And almost immediately one question did come to mind. How did a small town in Tunisia end up building one of the largest Roman arenas in the world? Now, to understand why something like the El Jem Amphitheatre actually exists here, you have to go back long before the Romans actually arrived. As before this region became part of the Roman Empire, it was home to indigenous Berber communities, and with it later becoming under the influence of the powerful Carthaginian civilization. But that all changed after the Third Punic War in 146 BCE, when Rome destroyed Carthage and took control of the region, turning it into one of the most important North African provinces. But this wasn't just another province, as it quickly became one of the most valuable parts of the empire, as the land here was actually ideal for agriculture. It had fertile soil, combined with wet winters and those long dry summers, making it perfect for growing crops like wheat, but more so olives, as over time this region became a major producer of olive oil, supplying cities across the Roman world. The town here, known as Thysdrus, wasn't a political capital or a military centre. It was something else. It was wealthy. And that wealth didn't just go to the Romans from Italy. Local landowners, many from the existing population, became rich as they adopted the Roman customs and actually became part of the system. The oil they produced was stored in large clay containers and transported along the Roman roads to nearby ports before actually being shipped across the Mediterranean. So this wasn't just some isolated town, it was actually part of a huge trade network. And with that level of wealth came ambition. In the early 3rd century CE, local elites likely made the decision to actually build this amphitheatre around 230 CE, possibly during the reign of Gordian III. Using locally quarried stone, they constructed one of the largest amphitheatres in the Roman world, clearly inspired by structures like the Colosseum, and it could actually hold around 35,000 people. What's even more impressive was how it was actually built. Unlike many Roman structures, it doesn't rely on deep foundations. Instead, it uses its sheer mass and clever engineering to actually stay stable, which is a big part of why it's actually still standing today. It likely took several years to actually complete, requiring skilled labour, organisation and a huge amount of resources. And when it was actually finished, it wasn't just somewhere, to watch events. This was an actual statement. But what actually went on inside a place like this? As by the time this amphitheatre was actually built, the Roman entertainment had become something much bigger than just a pastime. It was a system carefully designed and highly organised. As the El Jem Amphitheatre, events would have included gladiator fights, animal hunts and public executions, all staged in ways that were actually meant to entertain and to impress. But gladiator fights weren't always simple one-on-one duels. Some were carefully matched contests, between different fighting styles, while others actually involved multiple fighters, making things far more chaotic. Then you had the animal hunts, where you had animals like lions, leopards and bears were actually brought into the arena. Sometimes they fought trained hunters, and other times they were set against people who basically had little chance of survival. And these events weren't just, for the elites. Amphitheatres like this were actually built for huge crowds, as tens of thousands of people would attend, from wealthy citizens who were seated close to the arena to ordinary people who were higher up in the stands. And in many cases, the events were completely free, funded by the local elites who were trying to gain influence and popularity. Now, at the centre of it all were the gladiators. Now, most of these were actually slaves, prisoners of war, or criminals trained in specialised schools to fight different styles, each with their own weapons and armour. But not all of them were forced actually into it. Some of them even volunteered, drawn by the possibility of money, fame, or just a better life. Because if they actually survived and won, they would then gain recognition, rewards, and sometimes their very own freedom. But survival was never guaranteed, because beneath the arena floor, there was a whole hidden system of chambers, passageways where animals were actually kept and fighters prepared. They would use ramps, lifts and even trapdoors so they could actually be brought up into the arena suddenly, adding to the drama and making the crowd think that it was all very unpredictable, when in reality it was all carefully controlled, as this wasn't just, for entertainment, this was a display of power. But why did all of this eventually come to an end? As by the time this amphitheatre was actually completed in the early 3rd century CE, the Roman Empire was already starting to struggle. As from around 235 CE, during what was known as the crisis of the 3rd century, the empire went through a long period of instability, political chaos, economic problems, and constant internal conflict. And although things actually stabilised somewhat later on, it never fully returned to what it had been before. So the main problem was maintaining a place like this wasn't, simple. It wasn't just about keeping the structure standing. It actually meant constant repairs, organising events, and covering the huge cost that actually came with them. As the animals had to be transported across the empire, gladiators had to be trained, housed, and fed. And with the entire spectacles having to be planned and funded, it was all about resources, and they actually become very limited and much harder to sustain. As at the same time, society itself was changing. In the 4th century, under Constantine the Great, Christianity was legalized and began to spread across the empire. And with that came a gradual shift in attitudes, as the kind of violent entertainment that had once been so popular started to face criticism, and over time it became less accepted. But the games didn't just, stop overnight. They just, slowly faded out, just becoming less frequent, less central, and eventually disappearing altogether by around about the 5th century. And with that, the crowd stopped coming and basically the arena fell silent. But its story didn't just end there, because over time this place stopped being somewhere, that people came to watch others fight. It actually became somewhere where people came to actually survive. But how did a place built for entertainment end up being used for survival? After its original purpose faded, the El Jem Amphitheatre didn't just, get abandoned. It just kind of found a whole new role. With its thick stone walls, high structure, and limited entry points, it was naturally suited for defence. Now, this was perfect as new powers actually moved into North Africa, especially during the 7th century with the expansion of the Arab forces. Now, the region went through periods of conflict and change, and in times like that, people needed somewhere to go. So the amphitheatre actually became a place of refuge where local populations could retreat and actually defend themselves. Now, there are famous stories like the linking of it to Kahina, who is a Berber leader who resisted the Arab expansion in the late 7th century. However, this connection is debated, and historians aren't certain whether she was actually there. But the story still says a lot about how the structure was viewed at the time, not as entertainment, but as protection, as this role actually continued into the later centuries as well. But the problem was its strength also made it a target. By the 17th century, during the Ottoman rule, the amphitheatre had once again been used as a defensive position, this time by groups resisting authority. So to prevent it being used in that way again, parts of the structure were deliberately destroyed, likely using cannon fire. Not enough to actually bring it down completely, but enough to weaken it. But even after all of that, here it still stands. So what does a place like this actually mean today? As the El Jem Amphitheatre is one of the best preserved Roman amphitheatres in the world and a recognised UNESCO World Heritage Site, attracting tens of thousands of visitors each year. And that has a real impact, not just on the site itself, but on the town around it. Now, just outside you'll find small shops, local vendors and places to eat, just like the one where we stopped after walking through the amphitheatre. It was just a simple outdoor setup with our food being cooked on a small barbecue right in front of us, and it really added to the whole experience. And it's people like us, along with visitors from all over, that contribute to the tourism which plays such a big role here. Now, for many people in the town, it provides income, jobs and opportunities that might not otherwise exist. But it's not without its challenges. Visitor numbers can be unpredictable, and over time the constant flow of people also puts pressure on the site itself. So there's a balance between preserving the past and actually supporting the present. And I can only hope that this structure is still standing for many generations to come, so others can actually experience it for themselves and learn about its history and connect with the people who actually live there today.